Hey, everybody, I'm going to let you keep sort of streaming in here for just a few moments.
Or maybe Ray took it out.
Okay, excellent. Just like yesterday, feel free to pop who you are and what you're doing here in the chat box if you want to. Yesterday, I think approximately 0 people took me up on that offer, so don't feel like you have to, but it is an option for folks. We certainly want to make sure that these trainings feel somewhat connected to our community of advocates across the state. So that's one way that that can happen. And also, introverts be introverting. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. For those of us who didn't join us yesterday or are unfamiliar with who I am, I'm Sarah Owsley. I'm the advocacy director here at Empower. You are at the second of 3 trainings this week about the federal legislative process and federal advocacy. As we sort of head into a time period where possibly some of us are going to be doing quite a lot more federal advocacy than we expected. Today, we're going to talk about the budget, the federal budget. It's very timely. This is exactly the right time to be learning a little bit about what the federal budget is, how it's created and passed, what that all looks like, et cetera, and how advocates can help to influence that. Here we go. Here's our triangle of stability that we looked at for the first time yesterday. Remember that the things at the bottom of that triangle are really stable, difficult to change, relatively consistent over periods of time. And the things at the very top are the easiest to change, the most frequent to change, et cetera. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about executive actions and regulation together and what that process looks like. And today, we're going to talk about the budget, as I said. So as an intro, right, the budgetary process happens every year, so it's pretty frequent. It's mandatory. We have to have a budget or some sort of something has to happen with our money. We'll talk a little bit about what it looks like when we don't have a budget and how we've certainly all been influenced by that in the past several years. It's moderately difficult to influence. We go through our lawmakers to do that, and so sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't, right? But it is possible to influence as we move forward, both from that visibility campaign, lots and lots of folks care about this thing process, as well as for some organizations, right, they may receive a specific line of federal funding or programs that they're really familiar where they work with. And so those are often a little more influenceable. The budget process is supposed to happen every year. Congress also has an option to pass a continuing resolution when they cannot pass a budget. We'll talk a little bit about that continuing resolution process moving forward. The budgetary process is a process Congress decided relatively recently, and also one that really doesn't work very well at all. I cannot imagine in today's political climate any changes that would be substantive and beneficial are likely to happen to the budget process. But that is kind of where we are. The president, federal agencies, and each chamber all weigh in on the budgetary process. The president alone cannot write and pass a budget. In the same way that the Senate on its own could not write and pass a budget. So everybody really does, there's an amount of working together, collaboration, and compromise that's inherent in the process. Here in the United States, our fiscal year runs October 1st to September 30th, which is why we spend a lot of time in the summer talking about the budget before the October 1 fiscal year change. For folks who are concerned with fiscal years, I'm not a very good fiscal year person. My brain doesn't think that way, but for lots of folks it does, and I'm very grateful for all of you. Here's an image I stole off the internet that's kind of a quick rundown of what the budget process looks like, and we're going to go through again today each step, learn a little bit more about it, learn where we can influence and what we can do during that process. So the White House does propose a budget, right? The president's office does put together a budget proposition that is in no way required to be adhered to. The House writes its own budget. The Senate also has an option to sort of will review the full budget. Nobody is required to start with the president's budget, but it is part of the process that is issued every year. The House and Senate budgetary committees will review. There are also appropriations subcommittees that will review the budget as it moves forward. Then the full committee, right? We learned about subcommittees and committees yesterday. Then it'll go to the House or Senate floor. There's a final committee. House and Senate both have to vote on the final version of the bill, and then it's returned to the White House for the president's signatures. And we're going to go through each of those steps a little bit more thoroughly over the next hour. There are two main types of spending that we talk about in the budget. There's mandatory spending and discretionary spending. And I think as each of us like consider, maybe our own budgets or how we spend, plan out our own spending, right? Mandatory spending is things like those like hard costs that you have to pay for, right? You have to theoretically, right? Like you're working very hard to like put a roof over your head, right? So you're paying your mortgage or your rent. Discretionary spending is a thing that like you could or could not put resources to. So maybe you have like, I have, like a book spending budget, right? Maybe I will, or maybe I won't purchase books this month or this year, but it's an option that I want available to me. So mandatory and discretionary. At the federal level, when we're looking at that, the things that are going to be most common, probably to most of us in this room, mandatory spending, we can think about entitlement programs. So that is SNAP, Social Security, Medicaid. If you qualify for it and you apply for it and then you receive it, it is probably part of the mandatory budget. This means that the authorizing law requires an amount of funding, but there are some changes that happen to that funding over time. But the the outside structure, right, really goes through a law changing process, and we can't through the budget make substantial changes to those programs, generally speaking. Discretionary spending are things that we might consider like maybe we apply for it, maybe we qualify for it. That doesn't mean we necessarily get it. Housing vouchers are like that, right? Our community members who need housing assistance, they'll apply for it, will be out of resources, right? Only 1 in 4 families actually get that help because it's in the discretionary budget. So they can say, we don't have to fully fund this program. Research and defense spending are also both in those buckets. And while we may not be like as familiar with those buckets, certainly we understand, right, what research and defense spending are. The budgetary process can radically change the scope and function of those programs, though in most cases, it can't completely close or eliminate those programs. And so there's more flexibility that happens in the discretionary budget process, which is also why we see so many changes happen with that, and why when we're advocating on behalf of those types of programs, we do a lot more advocacy around it because every year we're fighting to make sure it at least maintains funding, if not gets a little bit of a funding boost. A couple types of federal spending that we can think about, right? Here on the left from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, we look at most of the spending in the federal budget is in the mandatory section. A portion of that spending is in discretionary, and we spend quite a lot of money every year on interest on the debt. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So as we look at like, how does that break down in a program capacity, right? 21% is Social Security spending, 13% is Medicare, 11% is ACA subsidies, CHIP, and Medicaid. Other mandatory programs, SNAP will fit under that at that 16%, 14% non-defense discretionary, 12% defense discretionary, and then the interest that we're paying. So an idea of where our resources go as we're preparing our budget each year. There are 2 words that you'll hear a lot about in the budgetary process that for lots of folks, they need some extra explanation, right? So authorization versus appropriation. You'll hear about them like a program authorization requires XYZ, or you'll hear about like appropriated funds for this program. Authorization is the process that establishes, continues, or modifies the program. It may include an amount of mandatory spending. It has to, have this percentage. We have to serve this many whatevers, but not always. Sometimes authorization comes through the budget bill. Often it happens in separate legislation that authorizes that program. Whereas appropriation is the actual funding that program is going to receive this year, right? It is really only a process that happens through budget bills, even when they pass a process or a law or a policy through the legislative process, right? That is usually just the authorization, and then the program has to be funded. That funding happens through the appropriation process. So the kind of like easy way I think about it is authorization is when my kids come to me and they say, can I go to the movies with some friends? Right. And I say, yeah, you can go to the movies. That's authorization. This is, yes, you can do this thing. Yes, you have this program. Yes, this is a thing you have to do or could do. Right. Whereas appropriation is like, not only can you go, but here's $20 to pay for your ticket. Right. Without appropriation, the authorization may mean very little. I don't have to give my kids, movie money just because I told them that they could go. But if they don't have money, me telling them they can go doesn't really do anything, right? They're still not going to see a movie. So they need the appropriation. They need the resources. If that movie trip were like part of a school day, right? I might have to give them those resources in order for that, authorization to go through. And so that would be a program, an example of that, like mandatory spending. I have to give them those resources. So the appropriation may mean, one thing, but the authorization often doesn't mean a lot without the appropriation. I could also only give them $10, right? They still could theoretically go to the movies. Maybe it's enough, maybe it's not enough. But I might radically change their ability to actually go to the movie or what that experience might be like through my appropriation process. They're still allowed to go. They just can't actually get in now, right? Um, so they could take their own resources and match that. There could be other ways that they could make that happen. I'm not saying they can't go, but I'm not facilitating that happening. Are there any questions around those two terms? I feel like there's often a lot of confusion about that. Okay. So the budgetary process, we're going to go through sort of step by step. So step one really begins when a new president is installed. Every 4 years, each federal agency is required to publish what's called an agency strategic plan that is going to lay out their general goals and objectives for the next 4 years. It happens every time there's a presidential election, and that sort of makes sense, right? What the EPA is going to do in the next 4 years is probably different than what the EPA did in the 4 years before that, because there's a set of program authorizations and there is a set of goals and objectives that might have been laid out by the incoming administration. And so that, might fluctuate every 4 years. It may stay exactly the same, but most often it's going to fluctuate every 4 years. Agencies then every year begin the process of thinking about their budget for the coming years, 18 months ahead, right? So not this next 6 months, but the 18 months ahead in the spring. They think about, here are the objectives and goals we set out. What type of resources are we going to need? Where can we move resources that we already have? Where might we need to appropriate more money? Where, what is it going to look like for us to get to that place, right? If my goal is to purchase a home 4 years from now, my budget is going to look really different than if my goal is something different than that, right? So you're thinking about that 18 months in advance. In September, they submit a budget request to the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, which is a department of the executive branch, but is also not the president himself, right? They are going to look at that, look at the goals. They compare the budgetary request to what the president's policy goals are and statutory requirements. So theoretically, the president's budget should always cover those statutory requirements or the required authorizations that need appropriation. Sometimes that process is formal. Sometimes it happens in hearings. Often that happens pretty informally, like just conversations. Um, the OMB is very close to the Congress building. It's very close to the White House. And so those staff are sort of intermingling pretty often. The OMB is going to prepare some guidance and approval. They send that back to the agency. They call that a pass back. And then that final package can be changed before being sent to Congress. So in some cases, right, the budget request from an agency that Congress received is one that has been changed pretty significantly from what the agency originally said, because the president is able to weigh in, the OMB is able to weigh in, and so we may not actually see what they originally thought they needed. We only see what the president and the OMB might think that they needed. Included in this recommendation from the president and the OMB, information about revenue from the past several years, overview and receipts of spending from the last few years. What has the program process looked like? What do they actually need to achieve whatever statutory requirements, as well as whatever goals are laid out? Revenue projections and how they got to those projections. So not just, well, I think $20 million are going to fall out of the sky for this program, but instead, like how they calculated what that potential projection is. Reviews of new laws or programs that have budgetary impacts. So when they passed the ACA, right, like this was a new program. It had a pretty significant budgetary impact. It was not a thing that could be ignored as they prepared the budget, right? It was going to change that bucket of money pretty substantially. So somebody's got to look at it. That's the process of the OMB and the president's office. A review of the policy goals and impact on current programs. So for example, right, when folks are saying like, we're just going to completely eliminate this program, that's going to have a pretty significant fiscal impact on that program, right? If now you have $0 instead of whatever your operating budget was before. They can also make some suggestions for funding per department and or program, right? So they might come up with a number that seems sort of in line with what this organization or what this program received last year or this agency received last year. It might be very, very different than what the agency received previously. So that is going to be the recommendation from the agencies and the OMB. They sort of like hand those packages. The president is going to also create a recommended budget after reviewing the agency requests. So the OMB and the agencies have been in conversation. The president's office also has the opportunity to review those recommendations. They are, remember, this starts in the spring. In September, they have to hand over their budget. The president is required to make a budgetary recommendation no later than the first Monday in February. That's very quick, right? Especially when we're instilling a president in mid-January. Very quickly, they have to come out with a recommendation for the budget. But it is statutory deadline. It is required to be submitted by this time. The president is going to provide that budgetary recommendation to Congress, and Congress can follow the president's recommendation, but is not obligated to. Often what happens is they'll sort of use that as a starting place, have their own conversations, and start to consider like what is a more realistic sort of like middle ground, but not always, right? The document from the president usually really reflects their own budget or their own priorities. And like I said, like maybe completely unrealistic. I think that as we think back to February, when President Trump's skinny budget and budget recommendations were released, a lot of us can think like there's a bunch of stuff in there that was really unrealistic. And so, you know, that's where it is, right? They aren't required to start from there. OMB can also put together a policy recommendation and some other guidance that might come with the president's recommendation. So memos and things like that to help us further understand what the president is recommending here, and not just us, but most importantly, Congress, right? Understand why and how. So for example, when he calls for the elimination of an entire federal department, what are the responsibilities of that agency and where are those responsibilities going to move to, that comes in memos and guidance from usually OMB or somebody else in the executive branch. Often what happens is the president only puts out a skinny budget because that's only discretionary spending. It's just recommendations around that discretionary budget. It doesn't have to include some of the other like lengthier, meatier kind of like policy wonky stuff. It doesn't have to talk about the deficit. It doesn't have to talk about projections about income or revenue, and like other mandatory spending programs, like what those are going to look like. It really is an opportunity to sort of like, these are the things within the Congress's control to make changes to. Here's what the president recommends those changes look like. So then the president sends out a budgetary recommendation. That is received by Congress, and then appropriations bills begin in the House. Usually it's 13 bills, a package of 13 bills, and they sort of are lumped together, right? Different agencies and departments that are very similar, that might look at the same type of programs, making sure that like sort of those things are equal. That allows some amount of agreement to move forward on the bills that they're in agreement on, right? The discretionary spending is really where a lot of that conversation can happen. Not a lot really can happen with the mandatory spending often. And so maybe some of those mandatory programs are bunched together. They're not going to change, Social Security. And so they're going to move it forward while other bills are still being debated. It also allows for a little bit of transparency. These bills are already hundreds of pages long when there's 13 of them, right? This one big beautiful bill situation we're all in the middle of right now, that bill is over 1,000 pages long. And there were a lot of House members who said like, oh, it includes this provision. I had no idea. I wouldn't have voted for it if I had known that, including folks who are pretty staunch Trump supporters, right? That's not an ideal policy-making process. And so sort of separating them out allows a little bit more transparency as well as that flexibility. All representatives in the House and folks in the Senate will have an option to submit requests specific to their districts. That often happens in the House, though the senators also could have like pet projects or specific things. So one thing for organizations to know is that there are sometimes opportunities to ask our congressional reps for specific line items or specific resources for specific projects. Usually relatively small compared to the overall budget. But if you can really like convince your lawmaker that this is a thing that the federal government should be involved in, there may be a process by which that can happen through the budgetary process. I am in no way promising you that if you need money for a specific program, that the thing you should do is go to your congressional rep. I'm just saying that is an option, is a thing that can happen. You can make those requests formally or informally. And I have been with advocates if they have done both, if they have sent, formal open letters, or as they have just like had quiet meetings and said like, these few $1,000s could really be useful in this place if we can fit it under this program. The Budget Committee has 12 subcommittees. Right, there's the whole House. There's a Budget Committee, which is relatively large. And there are 12 subcommittees under those who look at specific types of appropriations. Another reason why this like general 13 packages, this general 13 bill package is a useful idea. But bills move through the process relatively similarly to other types of legislation. They'll be in the subcommittee, there'll be committee conversations, there'll be a floor vote, there'll be some reconciliation process, and finally, right, it's delivered to the president. Starts in the House, moves over to the Senate, and then that final bill will move forward. When we've made it through all of that, right, the agencies, the OMB, the president, the House, and then Senate, the president has like sort of a final say relatively, right? If they sign the bill, then that's the law. That's our budget for the year. There is not a pocket veto on budget bills. So if the president chooses to not sign the bill, in 10 days, it becomes the law. They can veto portions of the bill or the entire bill, which will return it over to Congress, give them an opportunity to overturn that veto or make changes to bring it in line. That's sort of the like very last step, right? Step 4 is the very last step. And I think that that is it in this section. So I'm going to give folks a minute to think if they have questions about how that process works. Okay. I expected these to be much more questiony, but I'll take it. We're all familiar with the words continuing resolution, while we may or may not understand fully what they mean. As I said, right, the budget process is pretty broken. Congress designed this process, almost always they end up passing a continuing resolution because they can't fulfill their responsibilities by the deadline. Every year since 1997, we have had a continuing resolution before we have had a full budget. When they're individual bills, those resolutions can be on only specific programs. But when it's a full budget that we can't come to agreement on, then it's a full government, right, continuing resolution. It allows extra time by authorizing appropriating money at the same spending level, like to continue, right? So the same amount of money that you had last year, you'll have it per month or per day until a full budget is passed. Both chambers do have to agree to a continuing resolution, which is how we have had, government shutdowns, right? It usually just covers a portion of the budget. Sort of like extra programs may not be appropriated in this way. Sometimes, like just different, not everything is always, right? It's not like the full year's budget is carried forward. And if they don't agree to a continuing resolution, then the federal government or that portion of the federal government doesn't have any budget to operate. And it starts with non-critical agencies that will shut down. We can remember this happened in 2018. That was also the longest government shutdown in history. It was 35 days long where we didn't have any federal agencies. If you'll remember, right, like national parks were closed, federal buildings were closed, all sorts of like programs just didn't function. Many federal workers are furloughed. They're sent home. They may or may not receive back pay. Often they do, but it's not a guarantee. Even if lots of furloughed workers are paid back pay, that doesn't mean every furloughed worker received back pay. We do not get a break in our taxes. We're still paying our daily rate of taxes during these days when we're receiving no government programming. And often, right, that back pay comes back. And so these folks, in addition to not being able to work in jobs that they often really enjoy and feel passionate about, and that risk of maybe not receiving back pay, and certainly, right, like your mortgage company doesn't care that you're furloughed and a federal worker, they still want to be paid on this day. Your landlord still wants to be paid. The electric company still wants to be paid. In addition to all of those things, there's not really any relief for taxpayers, including those workers. Any questions about CRs? It feels like a term that we discuss a lot and also maybe we don't fully understand all the time. So as we look at the budget, we're going to think about incoming money, right, and outgoing money. So revenue is how we discuss money that's coming in. Here are another from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, like a breakdown of federal tax revenue. You'll see 36% of that revenue is payroll taxes, and payroll taxes are split between the employer and the employee. 49% is individual income tax. That's based off of your total income, and it's paid only by the taxpayer, and is like held only, by the individual. 9% is corporate income, and 5% is other. So that we can think about that as like interest on bonds that we might have sold, or investments we may have, et cetera. It's a really tiny percentage. You can see that most of our federal revenue comes from individual income taxes that the individuals shoulder on their own. I think lots of folks, when they look at this, might have different things that feel surprising to them. For me, certainly this like corporate income only being 9% felt really surprising to me because big corporations make a lot more money than I do. So why am I paying so much more substantially into the revenue of our country than they are? You can kind of take your own feelings as a result, right? Think about that for your own self. Another thing to think about as we look at the budgetary process is that a portion of the budget is the interest we pay on national debt, including theoretically ever getting back down to like actually getting to the principal of that debt, but we are nowhere near that. The US budget has been in a deficit since 2001. That deficit has shrank at portions of time in history, but not every year. We currently have a little over $36 trillion in debt that we pay interest on. We pay $2.6 billion a day of interest on this $36 trillion debt. Adjusting the debt limit is part of the budgetary process every year, and currently we're looking at $36.1 trillion worth of authorized debt. That's the debt ceiling, and can be adjusted as part of the budgetary process. It's adjusted, and it could also be adjusted outside of that process. So any questions on sort of the overall budgetary process and what's included before we talk about what is happening right now with our current budgetary process? I want to sip my water. What do you think? Okay. So as I said, this particular session is very well timed because we are right towards the middle of the budget process right now. So Trump suggested with his initial skinny budget and his budget recommendation that instead of having 13 individual bills, we have one big, beautiful bill, as he calls it. It is one of the top looked at congressional bills right now. They publish a list every day, if anybody's wondering, of the top 10 bills that folks are looking at. And it is always in the top 4-ish right now. It is HR 1. It is over 1,000 pages long right now. It was passed by the House in May, and it's currently in the Senate process. There's a pretty significant social deadline coming from the president's office to pass out of the Senate by July 4th. That is really only the president's office making that requirement. Is not, it's maybe going to get us through the whole process before the end of the, before the deadline, but who really knows? It is now in the Senate committee process where it's sitting right this moment. Over the weekend, a lot of information came out about the bird bath. So folks may have been possibly surprised for the first time to hear that was a thing that happened, to hear that we have an office called the parliamentarian, and that they have a pretty substantial job that they do every year for us. So the Senate parliamentarian is challenged to review the budget at the Senate level and look for any reason that portions of that budget couldn't be passed with a simple majority. There is a process by which they can pass these appropriation bills with only a simple majority, as long as it doesn't violate the bird law. And so these are the components that would put this language in violation of that. It doesn't have a budgetary effect. The Senate parliamentarian looks at all of the bills that move through the Senate, not just budget bills. So obviously the budget is going to have a budgetary effect. But in general, when we're looking at other types of bills, if there's not a budgetary effect, or if that effect is not what the budget resolution has called for, then it would violate the bird law and would need 3/5 majority. It might be outside the jurisdiction of the committee recommending it. It does have a budget effect, but a merely incidental one. That's the language that they'll look at with the budget process right now. If it increases the deficit beyond 10 years from right now, or if it includes changes to Social Security, all of these things would require that it needs a 3/5 majority to pass instead of a simple majority, 51%, right? Because this big, beautiful bill has a lot of budgetary effects that are not merely incidental. The current Senate parliamentarian, Elizabeth McDonough, kicked back a bunch of provisions, said like, this is not, you can't do these things. I have a link here I'm going to put in the chat box that has a more thorough list of all of the things that were removed by the parliamentarian or recommended to be removed. They absolutely still have the option of passing the budget with a 3/5 majority. They will never be able to do that as the language is currently written. So what is most likely is Congress is going to pull out these pieces or try to rewrite it to see if they can change the language a little bit to make it still something that can pass. This budget removed or eliminated several federal agencies, and many of them, the parliamentarian said you can't use the budget to do that. It forced some public land sales. The parliamentarian said you can't use the budget to do that. It included a lot of immigration changes, including like arresting undocumented immigrants. The parliamentarian said you can't do that. For Empower Missouri, one of the things that we were advocating against is requiring a state match for states to sort of chip in on the SNAP program. And the parliamentarian said, you can't do that. That is more than merely incidental. So I'm going to put this link. It's a New York Times article. And so hopefully you haven't used your one free one of the month to take a look at it, but it does go line by line and sort of point out all the different places that the parliamentarian recommended changing the language. You can probably find that list other places as well, but frankly, my daughter had an orthodontist appointment. It took longer than I expected today, and so this is the one I found for you. Any questions about the bird bath process? Okay, the parliamentarian role is nonpartisan. The person who's been in that role now has been in there for 13 years, including then Trump's first term. That person is hired by the Senate secretary. There is no set term that they sort of serve for. There is theoretically an option to fire the parliamentarian, right? Put someone different in the office who will kind of rubber stamp whatever folks want to do, whatever the president wants to do. That certainly is a choice. However, we've been talking the last couple of days and today as well that there is still judicial oversight. And so this gives folks who might want to engage the judicial branch in the budgetary overview pretty good direction around where that might be happening, especially if there's sort of a big pushback against the parliamentarian, and that's how they sort of deal with these recommendations. First, we're going to talk about how we might influence it as advocates. It's somewhat difficult because it's our federal elected officials and their staff. It is possible, and I certainly have seen success frequently with advocates that I have worked with. So in Missouri, the only one of our representatives who is on the Appropriations Committee is Mark Alford. So you should reach out to your own representatives, and also you can reach out to Mark Alford's office and talk to him as a Missouri resident and a person who cares about these things. If you're in his district, even better. There's a photo of his district kind of south of Kansas City into mid-Missouri-ish. Weirdly, all the districts are weird. They needed specific sides of the street, right, to make it work out. But there's his contact info for his office in DC. We can also find that information for any of his local offices that are there. Again, you can go to house.gov and find your own representative, put in your zip code, and pull up who is your elected official and reach out to them. You can reach out to your senators, right, our state senators, and ask for the things that we want and advocate there. Kinds of policies that happen through the budgetary process or policy changes, right? Spending priorities can shift year to year. We had a pretty significant example of that, right? In 2020, in 2019, spending priority for finding a COVID vaccine was 0. And in 2020, it was pretty high, right? So those spending priorities can shift. Taxes and taxing formulas can change. There's not a ton of flexibility. They can't suddenly change everything, right? In the same way that they can't suddenly change everything on appropriation side. But they can make minor changes to the taxing formula. We have seen that again, right? Different tax breaks that pass temporarily or pass, for the long term. That is also one of the things in the big, beautiful bill, right? Is solidifying Trump's tax breaks that the parliamentarian was like, you can't do that probably. So some changes can happen to our taxes formulation. Sometimes really impactful programs can begin there, right? If anybody remembers, several years ago, Space Force is still a thing. I had sort of pushed it out of my brain, but it is still a thing. It's still a operating branch of the military. It began as part of a defense budget bill. So that's pretty impactful, right? Something we're really looking at for a very long time. That began as a program in a budget bill. Because it's an annual process, these changes aren't always long-term, but they could be. They could also have really significant impacts and be difficult to change in the long term. So just because we might think like, even if we have to wait 4 years, we might get this change undone, right? That's a more difficult process. And there is some level of hope that that could be a thing that happens. Some program authorization allow a lot of changes to be dictated by the appropriation process. So Medicaid program eligibility can be changed by the appropriation process. Functionality of programs can be changed. The Pell Grant funding formula was changed several years ago. So who receives Pell Grants and how much? And that process happens solely through the budgetary process. Any questions about any of those things so far? Okay. And as we discussed, right, the judicial process, judicial review exists like underneath and alongside all of these processes. And that is true for the budget process as well. Less, but still there, right? So the court system usually is not really involved in the budgetary process unless some sort of lawsuit were to come about. The court system is funded itself through the budgetary process. Theoretically, there could be some substantial changes that happen to that program or to that agency, right, as it may sort of function, though isn't, that happen through the budgetary process. It allows for some changes to the judicial branch, but only ones that are merely incidental to the non-budgetary components of the provision. And so again, incidental changes could happen through the budgetary process to the judicial system and also to other programs. Our current budget bill, and I didn't look after the weekend to see if section 70302 was still included. There were several judicial pieces of the budget that were removed by the parliamentarian or recommended to be removed by the parliamentarian. Things like not being able to ever sue the Trump administration was in the budget, and the parliamentarian was like, yeah, that's not a thing we can do. There's this piece that prevents the federal court system from holding elected officials in contempt, which is a pretty hot topic right now, and or forbids courts from issuing temporary restraining orders. So this is a way that if this were to happen and be upheld, it could like really impact the judicial process. It doesn't seem super likely to make it through everything, right? As we look at this budgetary process with some discernment, but it is a thing that's sitting there right now and probably worth us keeping an eye on. Those of us who want to use the court system to make sure that things are staying in line the way that we want them to. Yesterday, I forgot to send out the survey, so I'm going to do that now while I allow for any other questions or thoughts to kind of bubble up.
All right, there you go.
Put that survey here in the chat box. So I thought we might get a question about some of what is happening as far as like pulling funding from different programs that came through executive orders. We're going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow. There is also sort of this thing happening, right, with like public news. It is also that there are lawsuits around that moving forward as well. Those lawsuits are not necessarily based on the actual budget process as much as the president can't change the budget because he's angry at someone. And so that's really what those lawsuits are about, as well as protected free speech. You can't withdraw funding that has been appropriated just because you dislike the way that they're talking about a thing. That is certainly moving through the judicial process as well. And so was ready to answer those questions, but folks are feeling shy today. Yeah, so Ashley asks if we can go over the bird rule, again, how it interacts with the budget because it doesn't feel super clear. So the bird rule process, I can share my screen again as well. The bird rule is not just about the budget, but it is also about the budget. What we're talking about right now is about the budget because we're talking about the budget as a whole, but the reason that it's in the news right now is about the budget. But the bird rule applies to all of the language that is passed through Congress. It is a process that forces the Senate to look at language that they're passing to make sure that it doesn't violate any like specific things. But while these changes can happen, they can't happen with a 51% majority vote. So if it's a bill that has to do with any of these 6 things, the Byrd rule requires that it be a 3/5 majority vote instead of 51%. Part of the way that they move the budgetary process forward more quickly is that it can be a simple majority. They also limit debate time, so there's no filibustering the budget. And they're not going to be able to do that with this bill if they leave the language that the parliamentarian flagged, because that language will require a 3/5 majority instead of 51%. So it doesn't necessarily say Congress can't do this way. Instead, it says if Congress is going to make this substantial of a change, it has to happen with a 3/5 majority. And it is extremely unlikely that any of what is currently in the budget bill is able to pass with a 3/5 majority. The thing that's relevant to the budget specifically is this line about a merely incidental impact on the budget, like effect on the budget, because certain things that have been flagged, it's not merely incidental. When you eliminate an entire federal agency, that's not merely incidental, right? That's significant policy change, significant program change. It might be outside of the budget or outside of the authorization for that program or agency to completely shut it down. So if Congress wants to do that, they have to do it with a 3/5 majority instead of a 51% majority. Ashley, does that explain things a
That
little
helped a
better?
lot. That helped a lot. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Congress can do a lot of stuff, right? As we learned yesterday, they just can't do a lot of stuff with a 51% majority. There are those checks and balances that are built in. We need a budget. We don't need federal agencies to be eliminated through it often. Okay. Alexandria asked in the chat if there are previous examples outside of this budget where the Byrd rule has been used. So the Byrd rule is applied to everything. So everything goes through that Byrd rule if they're trying to expedite it or they're trying to get a 51% majority. There likely are other examples. I don't have any off the top of my head, Alexandra. I am sure that in other spaces they've sort of flagged some of these. I definitely remember times where they have, said like a 51% majority can't be used on this bill, on this like budget reconciliation bill, or different ways that they've tried to like sort of maneuver things. I believe that the first time they passed Trump's tax credits or tax cuts, excuse me, that was partially flagged by the Byrd rule and then like changed. That's why it's temporary instead of permanent. And then that is one of the things in this current budget. That's that they want to make that permanent. And probably not going to be possible to do that this way. Okay. As a reminder, please take 2 seconds and fill out the survey form for me. I would really appreciate that. I will see you back here tomorrow at noon. At the end of, we're recording all 3 of these sessions. We'll send them all of the recordings out as well as PDFs of all of the slides. Those will come probably the beginning of next week, sort of depending on our comms team workload over the next few days. I will see you tomorrow. I am looking forward to that, where we will talk about sort of the top of the pyramid, the things that are most easily changed and most frequently changed. Thanks, everybody.